Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, everyone who is watching our broadcast today. Now we're starting our webinar on the topic of Russia, US, and China, and the prospects of the global zero. So the choice of topic is quite obvious because the question of non-proliferation now is very high on the agenda. Lately, on the October the 6th, the Norwegian Nobel Committee announced that it was awarding the Nobel Peace Prize to ICAN, the international campaign for abolishing nuclear weapons. And at the same time, we can see that the crisis around North Korea and its nuclear program is developing, and as well now the Trump administration is likely to block the deal with Iran on its nuclear program. And in this situation, the questions of non-proliferation, they come up in the news more or less every single day. At the same time, there is also the question with the START treaty, because we can hear that the accusations that Russia is violating the treaty now and again. So in the current context, I guess the cooperation between three major nuclear powers, Russia, US, and China, become vital. And in this sense, it is very interesting to discuss how, in this not easy international context, the countries could cooperate. So I would like to introduce our today's speakers. On my left hand is Richard Weitz, director of the Center of Political Military Analysis from Hans Institute, and the expert of Valdai Club, who is here on invitation from the Valdai Club. And on my right hand is Ilya Kravchenko, the expert of Russian International Affairs Council and the expert in the field of Russian-American relations. Okay, thank you very much for coming here tonight. Dr. Weiss, if you may, we will start with you. Can you share, please, your views on the problem?
Right. When I think about the nuclear question, nuclear cooperation between Russia, China, and the U.S., I sort of think in three broad categories. The first is what you spoke about in your good introduction, which is primarily a lot of questions related to arms control, disarmament. Traditionally, there has been good cooperation between the Soviet Union / Russia and the United States. Both countries have significantly reduced their nuclear arsenals from Cold War totals, and they've had a series of arms control treaties adopted by both parliaments and so on. But that phase is now a bit uncertain, that whole area. The second area is what I consider spreading. We talked about horizontal proliferation, how many weapons U.S. and Russia have. The next one I would say would be, vertical proliferation. The next one I would say would be horizontal proliferation. And that would be the spreading of nuclear weapons to new countries. And the particular concern immediately is Iran and Korea. But North Korea, but that can also be additional players who are not recognized as the five nuclear weapons states by the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And the last category, where we've seen a spurt of cooperation since the end of the Cold War, has been this question of nuclear security defined as preventing nuclear terrorism. My own view is that there's limited prospects for the first, and I'll explain why. The second, a bit uncertain. And the third, I think there's a lot of potential, but we need a stronger push there. So in terms of arms control, the problem we've reached for the last few years is that Russia and the United States want to proceed in different directions about what to do with the question of nuclear disarmament and arms control. The Obama administration wanted to go down. So they wanted to reduce the number of strategic offensive nuclear weapons that both sides had from 1,550 now to about 1,000 each. They wanted to reduce the number of weapons in storage. They wanted to reduce a couple other categories. The Russian government wanted to go out. So they said that the traditional approach to arms control had realized its potential, and now we need a different direction. And they the question of strategic defenses, or U.S. ballistic missile defense in particular, we know about, was one issue they wanted to make sure would be covered in future arms control agreements. But there was also questions of hypersonic vehicles, something that being able to basically conventional weapons that had strategic potential is how I interpret the Russian view. So that could be cyber weapons, that could be space-based weapons, anything that could have an effect equivalent to a nuclear weapon strike. They felt we had to cover that. And the Russian government also wanted to include more countries in this approach. So it couldn't just be, as it's been in the past, a bilateral treaty between Russia and the United States. It had to include other countries. Clearly, this would have been Britain and France. That's something, since Russia considers them members of NATO, and so it would take into account their nuclear forces in any balance of power type exercise. But there was also more or less, the explicitness of this depended a bit on the Russian official, at least in the Russian analysts, making sure that China was captured in some of this process. And potentially that include other countries that have or might get nuclear weapons. India, Pakistan, now North Korea, Israel, if it has nuclear weapons, might have to be considered. I mean, the Obama administration said this is too complicated. Russia and the US still have more nuclear weapons than everybody else, so we should have one more round of reductions, and then we can start addressing these others. Whereas the Russia government position was, it's already gone far enough. We need to start dealing with these other issues. China has refrained from any involvement in formal arms control with the United States or with other countries. I mean, the Chinese argument has always been, you, Russia, you, United States, cut your forces, and then when you get down to, or 2-0, we'll participate in the further reductions. But until then, you've got to clean up your own house before you come to us. And other countries, Britain and France, for example, were not eager to participate. They would argue that their forces serve a different purpose than the Russian and U.S. forces. They're more national deterrence and so on. Now, besides these traditional complications, we now have a new issue, which it's a bit unclear the magnitude of this. The Trump administration appears to be adopting an entirely new approach to arms control. And we don't know for sure on this and some of the other questions because they're still undertaking their nuclear posture review, and that will take a couple months. We just had the Iran strategy last week. We had an Afghanistan strategy rolled out a few weeks ago, and the nuclear strategy should be done by the end of this year. But when and what we as think tank analysts are going to be looking for is what they're going to say about whether in the Russia, U.S., and China dimension. Do they want to cut forces down further in the Russia, U.S. dimension? Not clear. Do they want to do what President Putin suggested, which is extend the current treaty that's operating between Russia and the United States, a New START treaty, which expires in 2021, another 5 years? They can do that. They don't without congressional or Duma approval. It's just an executive agreement. President Trump appeared to have not been receptive to that idea when it was raised informally, supposedly, according to me, sort of in a phone call with earlier. But I'm not sure that's the final decision. That was just President Trump's initial reaction when he heard about the proposal. And once it goes through the bureaucracy, once he hears all the views, then he'll reach a decision. But the question of whether they'll go down much further is questionable. I mean, President Trump appears to want to, if anything, increase the capacity of U.S. nuclear forces. So that might be out of sync. How the U.S. is going to deal with China is also a bit unknown. I mean, China has basically not been a major target of U.S. strategic arms control talk. So we don't have a formal treaty. We don't have much of a dialogue even with China on the question of what's happening with the Chinese nuclear forces and the U.S. nuclear forces in terms of numbers and so on. The Chinese are very secretive. They don't, unlike Russia and the U.S., they don't. There's a lot of speculation about what those numbers are. A lot of them are, based in tunnels. We don't quite know. And some Russian analysts have actually said that the magnitude, the Chinese, the numbers are approaching those of Russia and the U.S. And there are a couple of U.S. scholars of that. Most people think not. Most people think it's lower, but those not. Who knows? They won't tell us, so we're just sort of guessing. So that, I think, so that's a bit. So we're at the situation we don't quite know what is going to make. My general view is we're not going to see much progress. And in addition to the desire of Russia and the United States to if anything build up their nuclear forces, China's lack of enthusiasm participating, and disagreements over existing treaties. New START, actually, the U.S. confirms that Russia has been complying. Russia has to get down its totals by the time the treaty takes full effect in a few months. But it looks like from the latest reductions, Russia will go there, and the U.S. is already there. It's more a question of the INF treaty, where Russia and the U.S. are accusing each other of violating the treaty. And the fundamental problem with that treaty, of course, is it's just Russia and the U.S. who are actually constrained. Everybody else, China and others, are building massive numbers of missiles in this 500 to 5,500 kilometer range. So I'm not very optimistic for arms control in the next few years. Maybe looking ahead, Trump and if he stays in office, because he has adopted revolutionary views on some issues, and the Russian may think of a new way to construct the arms control process. But the question of non-proliferation, which I suspect we'll spend a lot of time on, so I won't go into detail much now in my opening presentation, I think there are opportunities for trilateral cooperation. I mean, Korea is an obvious one. If any Korea settlement you could think of, any way to deal with the North Korean nuclear and missile issue, it's going to have to involve Russia, China, and the U.S. In some capacity. Same with the Iran process. I mean, the decision taken by President Trump last week means that the future of the of how Russia, China, and the U.S. are going to deal with the Iranian nuclear question is now a bit more open than it was before. But we wouldn't have had to address it in any case, because the operating agreement, the Joint Comprehensive Program of Action, the terms start expiring in a few years. So we were going to have to discuss that anyway. India, Pakistan is an interesting area that because there's these countries are building up their nuclear forces. They're actually so close together physically, and their rivalry is so active in terms of in the terms of terrorism and so on. You could think of a lot of triggers for a nuclear crisis. We've got the diplomacy of that region's in flux. Russia and Pakistan are improving relations. China has good ties with Pakistan. The U.S. has good ties with India. So in theory, you could think of some ways in which these countries could become more involved. The problem is, at the moment, India and Pakistan are not interested in having other countries participate in this process. The final area, I think I'm actually most optimistic of in terms of keeping nuclear material away from terrorists, and this is done through reducing the amount of nuclear material, moving away from reactors that produce this or even from medical isotopes to less dangerous material, securing nuclear power plants, cyber security, limiting the incentive and opportunities that people expert in this, nuclear scientists and so on, have to sell their insights to terrorist groups or becoming self-radicalized. I think there's a lot of potential, because clearly there's none of our governments or most of our citizens are in favor of nuclear terrorism, right? So that's a clear common interest we share. The problem has been that there's a bit, where we're going to go next is a bit uncertain. We had the nuclear security summits. They made a lot of progress, and Russia and the United States had a leading role in this. But the last summit occurred last year with President Obama. It's not clear what President Trump is going to do. The Russian government did not participate in the last summit. They felt that these summits had realized their potential, and they wanted to go in a different path. And I think the Russian position is more to focus on building up the International Atomic Energy Agency in terms of nuclear security. China and the U.S. actually cooperate pretty well in this area. We've got a nuclear security center that the countries are working on. They've been partnering in getting African countries to either end or restructure their nuclear reactors so that they don't make such dangerous, they don't make separated plutonium. They use a less proliferation sensitive process. But there's still a lot of unrealized potential. But again, we're sort of waiting to see what the position of the Trump administration will be as we go forward. But so, thank you. Those are the three broad areas. But I'm eager to hear our colleagues' views and then going ahead, viewers' comments and questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. White. Before I pass the word to Ilya Kravchenko, I just wanted to mention the thing I forgot. That if you have any questions and you didn't ask them before, you can still ask them during the broadcast, and I will read them in the second half of our webinar. So, Dr. Kravchenko, can you maybe share the views of what is the Russian position on that?
Yes, thank you, Nikolai. Thank you very much for your presentation and issues that you raised regarding the nuclear arms control and non-proliferation. In my position, and maybe basically in the position of the Russian government, nuclear proliferation has failed because the countries that now obtain nuclear weapons, they are not the ones that were that were present at the beginning, but like the Soviet Union. The United States, then some countries from Europe like Great Britain and France, but eventually we have India and Pakistan that you've mentioned that don't want to cooperate at all, and there are no strains that can be used in order to somehow make them talk to each other regarding the issue of not using the nuclear materials and using nuclear weapons. And the same with Israel, and the same with North Korea. Another issue while discussing this question from the Russian perspective is to what extent we need to reduce the number of nuclear weapons, and which number will be sufficient for the nuclear proliferation to actually work and never be used after all. Because the current numbers and the numbers that, for example, Israel have presumably have, because there are not so many so much data about it. It's like 60 rockets or something, 60 missiles that can be launched. Will this number will be working in the sphere of nuclear non-proliferation, or it's 100 rockets, or it's 200 or 500. So there is no exact number that can be raised throughout talks with our colleagues from the United States or from China also. And China, that you've mentioned, there is no such exact data too about China. Here in Moscow, people tend to view that China pretty much exaggerates the number they have regarding all spheres of China's governmental politics, and also regarding the sphere of economics, the military capacity they have. They always try to exaggerate things. This is just one perspective, but it's the main perspective that works. And if you understand that it always exaggerates, it doesn't really help, because you don't really know what's the capacity they have, and also the influence China has on North Korea. Is it really so much? How can we put pressure on Pyongyang and influence them on actually stopping from new missile tests? Because there are no tools that actually be used in order to stop Pyongyang. And we've seen so far that every provocation from Trump's administration, from the perspective of talking, every oral provocation works in a direction when a new missile is launched. And the problem is that how much will it be continued? How many times will these provocations be continued, and the new missiles will be also launched? Do we see a progress in the military capacity and the military sphere in North Korea? Yes, we do. And For example, like 10 years ago, not so many experts were actually thinking that the North Korean government will have the ability to launch missiles from not actually from, but to that extent far from the territory that they try to control, and the threats that now they use in order to somehow influence the American government as they view it from themselves, to attack Guam, for example, military base. They can do it or they cannot. The thing is that in reality nobody really knows what is going on in North Korea, and the same is with China. So can there be a trilateral talk between China, North Korea and the United States regarding this issue? I don't think so. I don't think it will actually work, because North Korea is not really eager to cooperate with the United States and also with China, because China is not helping so much North Korea in the military sphere so far, and as we know, and in the political sphere, because North Korea, when it comes to the question of sanctions, China is not the country that tries to restrain from promoting new sanctions, and the same with Moscow, with Russian Federation. Will it work if we have a trilateral talks with Russian Federation, China, and North Korea? There's also concern about this sphere. So the questions that you raised and the answers that we have or don't have, they somehow show that this whole sphere of nuclear non-proliferation, it doesn't really work. So what to do? So far we have the treaty that will expire pretty soon, well, regarding the years that it has been working. And if we have another treaty, or we try to prolong this treaty, will it also help new countries to obtain nuclear weapons? Because we have some instability in the Middle East, and this instability can lead to Iran actually finally getting the nuclear weapons. Will it somehow be stopped, or can it be stopped? The sphere is really very difficult to understand, and the idea that the politicians themselves in all of the countries that we've mentioned today, they don't really see the issue going on in this sphere, because for example in Russian Federation, the vast majority of people, of citizens, don't view nuclear non-proliferation as something good, because losing nuclear shield will lead to well, not the destruction, but to reduction of military capacity of Russian Federation, which will be eventually used by Russian opponents in the world. And the same, I guess, with, for example, Trump's electorate that actually voted for him. They supported his ideas of tough talks with Iran and so on and so forth. So can leaders of our countries actually go forward in this sphere without losing their support in their own countries? This is also a good question, and I don't think there is an answer now, because Trump is really eager to go on for the second term, and because for the most part he's spending time in golf clubs and also trying to talk to with his electorate, and it actually works, because the support amongst his electorate so far is actually growing. Not among those who were against him, of course, but within the sphere of his interests, well, people stand by him. But as for China, I don't think it will also work this way. Perhaps with the countries of Europe that possess nuclear weapons, it might work in a way, because they, especially in Great Britain, people tend to have more liberal ways. But now we have Brexit also, and this ongoing amount of populism in political sphere. And when it comes to nuclear weapons, populism is mostly used against the idea of nuclear non-proliferation, because it also shows, if you try to reduce the number of weapons, it means that you are against a high level of protection for your country, because talks cannot save your country from enemies attacking. Also, this is the simplest logic, but it works with the electorate, and we've seen so far that it really is a negative tendency nowadays in the political sphere. So from Russian perspective, so far, it's so easy to talk about nuclear proliferation on summits, on conferences, but when it comes to the real tools and levels of actually using it, there is no exact data that shows that what will be enough to reduce the number of rockets and try to stop other countries from obtaining, because it failed so far. So this whole idea of nuclear non-proliferation is a good idea, is a noble idea, but will it actually work if it didn't work before? And it failed every time countries tried to negotiate things about nuclear non-proliferation or reduction of nuclear materials. Yes, the United States and Russia, we have reduced our numbers, well, pretty much since the end of the Cold War. But still, it's enough to destroy the world for many, many times. So the idea is that we didn't have a big war, like a new world war, since the countries had started to have to possess nuclear weapons, and among the majority of Russian politicians, especially in the State Duma, and also, well, in the both chambers of parliament in general, this idea dominates that nuclear weapons is actually a good thing to have, because if countries have nuclear weapons and they control these weapons from getting out of the country to the hands of terrorists, it prevents the new clashes between the countries and actually the new wars to start. So why do we have to always promote this idea of reduction of nuclear materials if there is no use actually to just to build new rockets? We can just we can have this number as we have now, do not reduce it anymore, but do not build new rockets. This will be enough to have this status quo in the military sphere, because countries will don't have to start a war, because they will eventually destroy each other. But while following this logic, we arrive at the idea that there is also a pretty heavy military capacity without actually possessing nuclear materials. And where should we put this sphere? Because especially in the United States, with a budget that covers the whole globe, and how will it be used? If countries finally accept, well, maybe on a huge conference like Trump and Putin or other leaders will accept this idea that, okay, let's stop talking about nuclear weapons because we know we will never use them. But what comes with what happens with the military capacity that we have? So many tanks, aircraft carriers, and so on and so forth. Where should we actually put them? Should we also reduce the number of tanks and the military aircraft carriers? Well, maybe this is what we should actually start talking about, to reduce the number of the military sphere and the capacity we have, so that the countries will not actually have this ability to sell this to sell these weapons and new tanks to the Middle East countries or to African countries or to Asian, to any other country, so that this whole sphere will stop to extend and to evolve. Because if it doesn't evolve, that there is no actually news of a high nuclear capacity and of a high military capacity. So too many things going on with this sphere. But the best position, of course, that new countries should never. This number of countries that now possess nuclear weapons should never be extended. But the countries that already have these nuclear weapons, there is actually not so much efficiency if we start to reducing the numbers, because it will not actually do any good thing for the balance of powers, if we may say it. So this is the basic idea I wanted to share with you, and I was actually we'll be really glad to continue talking about this sphere.
Thank you very much, Ilya. I think there's one point which we didn't touch that much so far is the Iran nuclear deal. And I think that's the question I would like to ask both of you. Can this deal be saved at this point so far? And if it cannot be saved, how likely is that Iran will resume its nuclear program? Because how much stimuli it will have not to do so, I would say. So maybe we can start again with you, Dr. Weitz, and then we'll pass the word.
Okay. Before I forget, I have to say I was very impressed that you could do that all in English. I couldn't do that in Russian, that whole long presentation. That was very impressive. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, where we are with the Iran nuclear deal is the Trump administration has decided that the deal does yield some benefits, and Iran has generally complied with the deal. But the terms of the deal, as formulated in 2015, have limits and defects that need to be corrected. And so they want to start a process of discussion and action to strengthen the terms. And that includes dealing with some of the limits that will expire in time, dealing with some of the issues that weren't covered, particularly Iranian missile launches and testing, and generally addressing some of the weaknesses. And the president has decided to use a mechanism in U.S. law to do that. He is required by U.S. law, not by the treaty, the agreement, or the UN, to certify every 60 days that the Iran is complying with the deal and that it's still in the U.S. interest. And he says now he's not convinced it's in the interest of the United States, so he wants Congress to work with foreign governments to strengthen it. And so now Congress has a couple months to think about what measures it could take to make to raise the barriers against nuclear proliferation in the Middle East. The expectation is Iran is not going to change, at least unilaterally, it's not going to make any changes in its behavior to address the concerns that President Trump laid out. But the hope is that other countries will help to address some of those. So there's been discussion, such as by the French president, about some kind of supplemental agreement that would put some limits on Iranian missile activities, and that could see, for example, the Europeans limiting the transfer of technology that could be used for that, and Russia and China would, of course, be welcome to participate in that from the U.S. perspective. There could be other measures to address issues that are somewhat less relevant to the nuclear question, such as, it's more long-term relevance. Iran's relationship to some of its other countries, some of its the ties it has with certain groups that are considered to be terrorists in the United States, and so on. And then again, it looks like the Congress, many members like the deal, don't want to do anything to change it, so they're going to oppose any measure. There are many members who hate the deal and want to see it discarded, but most of them, people seem to think that, at least for now, it's good to have it unless we're sure we can get something better, but they're willing to see if we can get something better. And so they're talking about some possible new restrictions. They're talking about relaxing the certification requirement so that President Trump won't have to, every 60 days, he doesn't like doing this, certify that when it's complying with the deal. But it's not dead. It's not clear the U.S. would even move to kill it. It sort of depends on what reactions they get from other countries. I see this more as launching a bargaining deal-making process. That, we've got a deal. Trump thinks we could have done better. He thinks he could do better. He's going to try it and see. But if he can't, then the U.S. will just wash their hands of the deal. Then it's not clear yet. So it sort of depends on what happens here and in Beijing, but also Europe and other countries.
The problem is with Iran is actually this in the from Russian perspective is not so much alike, but still similar to North Korean issue. When putting too much pressure on a regime makes the regime to wish actually obtaining these nuclear weapons, because when there is a deal that we stop using our uranium capacity to actually make a nuclear weapon missile, when you dismiss all the sanctions, well, at least most of the sanctions, so that our country can be integrated in the world economic sphere and political sphere and not be isolated anymore. But then a president comes that says, well, that deal is actually a bad deal, so we have to put too much pressure on Iran because Iran is an enemy to Israel. But I guess is the basic idea of Trump's administration for now, as we've seen with UNESCO actually, while getting out of and taking this decision of getting out of UNESCO, Trump actually pointed out that UNESCO is against Israel. But he is not the first one who is actually doing this thing, because actually Obama administration in 2011 stopped financing UNESCO, and the laws that actually Trump tried to use when taking this decision were actually adopted and promoted in the 90s by the Clinton administration also. And this fear and the idea that all that this traditional U.S. allies that Trump is actually trying to protect from someone, and showing that he has this power of shielding these countries from the enemies aside, means that he's dismissing all the decisions and all the actually good deals that were made before him. Maybe it's his obsession with Barack Obama. I don't know for sure, because sometimes it seems that way. But we have also the good example of Obama and Netanyahu, that they didn't like pretty much each other, and every time they talked, it was it was seen that they had this pressure going on between them. But the two countries, the relations between the two countries, Israel and the United States, it expanded pretty much, and the deal and arms deals that were reached throughout this. So this personal conflict, it didn't actually influence the relations between the countries. So maybe we will see this also going on with Trump's administration, that his personal issues with some leaders of countries in the world will not coincide with this basic idea of normal relations between the countries, especially when it comes to sanctions, when it comes to the military capacity that the country that the sanctions were against has, as for example in Iran's case. But it also raises the question of this sphere of this type of council that Trump is actually listening to, and whose ideas are put into Trump's head, if there are any ideas that can be put into his head besides his family's ideas. Because it's really vital to understand if he is really going to talk with experts as Obama did throughout his administration, when at the very beginning he used this idea of revolving doors and introduced a vast amount of experts from Brookings, from Rand, from other countries, or from other think tanks, and which actually who actually influenced pretty much his whole idea. And for example, Michael McFaul, who is an academician from real academia, influenced his idea of trying to normalize relations with Russia so much. Will Trump follow this step? Will he actually follow this path and took steps in order to normalize relations with not only Russia, but try to implement these ideas from think tanks? Because so much as I've seen the think tanks in the United States, they how to put it, do not really agree with Trump administration when it comes to dismissing the deals, and especially the deal with Iran. Will he listen to his council, and will he actually introduce new, fresh ideas from the think tanks into his council, and let them help him to take these decisions and to implement maybe not so bad ideas after all, because the experts that are working on this field, as Europe, for example, have this huge experience regarding this sphere. But Trump is not really, as far as we've seen, eager to listen to experts from any other sphere, but for the military sphere. So maybe this is the question why we can't actually make a new deal, or still help this deal from collapsing. So I don't really see how it works after all, but maybe you can at least tell us maybe some hints of yours about this sphere. Do you see, I mean, it's really interesting for me, do you see this as a possibility for the new administration to start actually working closely with the think tanks community, or we will see just a continuation of this very orthodox, I would say, approach to politics regarding the sphere of using only generals to talk to about the sphere of containment of some countries like Iran. It's really vital, I guess, for the understanding of what we will see in the future.
Yeah, of course. Yes.
Yeah, generally, this administration, it's true, it's less influenced, at least Trump, White House, is less influenced by think tanks, I think, than in the past. The president seems to listen more to generals, but also business people and people who've who've actually run companies, people. He's also, because you've seen shift in his position, he listens to foreign leaders. So when he met with President Xi of China, they had a discussion about Korea, and that led him to change some of his views. But think tanks, there are some that are pretty influential. The Heritage Foundation, for example, he turned to provide a lot of advice on how to, what kind of Supreme Court justices to pick. My own institute, though not me personally, but some of my colleagues have influenced the administration's approach to healthcare, some regional security issues, perhaps the Iran deal. I'm not sure on that. But so there are some, but in general, it's compared to, like, as you said, Obama or previous, it's not a major a source of ideas at the highest level. I think President Trump's contacts with think tanks are less than perhaps some others. It's just he tends to like more people who have done experience in the military or business world.
So he views them as a group that actually has this idea of promoting national interests around the world, American national interests, regardless of the think tanks that are actually also promoting the American ideas abroad and inside the United States. But maybe it's his experience regarding this business sphere that to trust only the very few in his inner circle and to not let anyone enter this circle. Maybe it's this sphere, because as we've seen from the TV show, he actually let his family participate in the TV show, and not anyone else. So it also shows maybe.
I forgot his family. You're right. His family is another important influence. So business people, personal associates, family, military. Yeah, some think tank influence. Depends a bit on the area. He seems to be, some areas he's open, other areas he's already decided, so it's not going to have much impact. The good thing about the U.S. think tank community is there's a lot of them, and the views vary. So some of the views will have resonance among the current administration, but probably the ones that write most on arms control directly, Arms Control Association or Brookings or Carnegie and something, they probably have less influence with this administration than previous ones. And as well as these are also internationally focused think tanks. They're either they want to promote cooperation between the United States and other countries and so on, whereas he tends to be more gravitate more towards nationalist groups. Media also appears to have a lot of influence on him. Some of the media,
Fox News channel,
right? He appears to watch that and take a lot of information ideas from that as well.
So maybe we'll finally see someone from the TV show getting a high position in the White House after all.
Well, we had that in some of like Bannon and some, but it doesn't. Not all of them have stayed, and there's a lot of turnover. So it's hard. We can't be sure that in the future things won't have more influence because there's so much turnover and so many unfulfilled positions that you could still see a lot of think tank people. For example, the new Assistant Secretary for European Affairs, Victor Nunes comes from the think tank world.
Yeah, well, SIPA as far as
So there are some. So it might increase over time.
Well, yes, finally, and perhaps as we've seen for now, Trump is getting too much influenced by the establishment as far as we've seen it, because from the talks and from the rhetoric that he had at the beginning of his presidency and now, it changed drastically as far as you've seen. He's finally starting to behave and act like a president he should have been from the very beginning, because actually, and the latest incidents with the hurricanes also. At the beginning, he was not so effective when talking to the public, but finally he started to understand that, well, all his actions are viewed very closely by the public, and not only the public, but his voters actually. And maybe he'll also use this idea of being the president means you're always like 24/7 under strict control from the media also. So maybe you should start behave more like a global leader. You are finally. We'll see it.
Yeah, I'd say that you're right. You've seen his foreign policy statements and behavior change over time. He's moved closer to the mainstream in both accounts, and that could be because of influence of think tanks, could be influence of the office. What he said, he knows more. He's getting more diverse views. So you're right. I think Dmitry Suslov refers to like the normalization of U.S. foreign policy. He's not too happy about it, but he says it is reverting back to traditional views.
To the basic logic that is more that it's easier to understand how it works than it was at the beginning of the Trump administration, when nobody really understood what is going to be like in the nearest future.
Okay, so we have some questions from our readers. And the first one, there are actually separate questions. One question is to Richard Weiss and another one to Ilya Kravchenko. So the question for the Richard Weiss is it possible to change the configuration of the TED anti-missile system in Korea and change it in the way that it will not threaten Russia and China?
Yes, I think it's a good question. I think the answer is yes. I think that THAAD, its capabilities are good but limited. So it's most effective at shooting down missiles that are not that are sort of mid-range, intermediate range, something a few thousand kilometers, but not an intercontinental ballistic missile. So China and Russia, this system can't really interfere with their strategic nuclear deterrence, whereas it can provide some protection for South Korea, but mostly for Japan and the U.S. bases in East Asia. So I think that you could construct a missile defense architecture in East Asia that would provide defense for Japan and South Korea and U.S. bases and other potential countries under threat, without having degradation of Russian and Chinese nuclear forces. The Chinese at times sometimes are concerned about the radar, but they could move their testing field away from the radar if it was a major concern. I think some of the ideas that the Russian government and NATO governments were considering in maybe a decade ago and how to deal with European defense. There was President Medvedev came up with an idea of sectoral defense. There was talk about having some kind of confidence building measures, visibility. I think that could work well in the Korea situation, just because of the geography, because of the common concerns countries have with desiring to do whatever we can to cooperate on the question in North Korea. So I think it is possible, and it might be something that it'd be great for RIAC and Hudson and others to think about how to construct that architecture. Because I don't see that.
Topic,
yeah,
yes.
yeah. So that's maybe a good agenda item for our future work in this area.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. And the question is the question for you is. Does Russia have any constructive strategy for solving the nuclear program with North Korea? And if it has, what its basic
Well, it's quite
traits?
quite an open sphere, because our foreign ministry and president also talked a lot about this, and the idea is quite simple. It had to be done from both sides, from the United States and from North Korea, because it's viewed in this sphere nowadays. The uphold of any provocations from the United States regarding the pressure on North Korea and the talks of like destroying and wiping out the entire North Korean population, like Trump did in the United Nations. And from the North Korean side, the actually upholding of all testing of new ballistic missiles and any testing at all. Like, if two countries actually decide to cooperate and stop doing what they're doing now, maybe it will promote to a new level of cooperation, and at least in starting the discussions between not maybe like two leaders in personally, but at least the foreign ministries, or maybe on a lower level of communication, but at least this communication will start. Well, we've heard from Trump that this level of communications is actually going on, and it never stopped, but it's what Trump said, and we can't really rely on what Trump is saying, unfortunately, nowadays, because sometimes what he says doesn't coincide with what the administration is really doing. But I do believe, and I don't know, maybe you also do believe that the communications are going on. Eventually they cannot stop, because the issue is very high and very dangerous regarding this area, not only for the Koreans, but for the United States citizens, and for Russian citizens too, because closeness of yes, for the region. If at least a couple of nuclear missiles will blast in this region, well, it will ruin the entire, maybe like tens of thousands of kilometers around this area. Not will be destroyed, but will be devastated by the effect of the nuclear weapons. So everybody understands it, and I guess North Korean leaders also understand it, but they have nothing. They have no limitations, and they have no. If they start to talk with the United States from their perspective, if they will be the initiators of this talk, this will lose their support among the citizens of North Korea, as like this is the basic logics of elites in the authoritarian or totalitarian regimes. If you start to show your support for dialogue, for talks, and without using this, without having this big stick with which you can hit your opponent every time you want, this will eventually lose the support of your people, that they will see you and view as a weak leader and so on. But this is one idea. There are other ideas. The problem with North Korea is, we've mentioned it before today, is that it's really it's a very close society, and actually most of the experts that do come and do visit from Russian side North Korea, every time they do it, they of course are under strict control from the North Korean authorities, and every move is viewed and in a way that they have to be shown what North Korea is like, not what they actually can see from their perspective, as people from academia, from militaries, from economics, from politics, from think tanks, when they come there, they really want to, in order to understand how it all functions and where it can all finally lead. We need to talk to people, to real people who somehow influence on the decision-making level. And if you cannot do it, then what's the point of actually coming there and talking about how can we deter and control the nuclear disarmament of North Korea, if the only thing that we understand is that North Korea is controlled by a straight leader, and you can only talk with him about all of the issues. So this is a very big question. But Russia has this proposal that's not unfortunately taken into seriousness in both in North Korea and United States for now, at least. Maybe it will be, and the provocations and from both sides will finally stop, and we'll try to sit down and talk with each other. Maybe it will be a trilateral talks between Moscow, Washington, and Pyongyang, and maybe it will help, because Moscow will be viewed as in this case as a place, or not a place, but a player that can somehow be an initiator in these talks, so that the two leaders in the countries will not lose their support. Maybe it will help.
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
Just building on that. So there is a different Russia. I know there's the Russia-Chinese proposal for a suspension of North Korean missile tests and nuclear tests, along with a suspension of major U.S. And South Korean military exercise, military deployments. But there's a separate Russian proposal?
Well, it's like a proposal, but it's not the dominant view, because the basic view is to reduce the military capacity from both sides to actually attack each other. But in general, we all know that if there is an attack, that of course, North Korea will lose eventually, but both countries and the United States, also South Korea and Japan, will lose in the sphere of casualties, of course, and an economic and political sphere. Right. So if this is a talk, well, it's like with the nuclear non-proliferation. If it fails, then and we try to reduce, why don't we try to come to this from a different perspective? So there is an idea, but unfortunately it's not like the dominant idea, but it's one of the ideas that can be implemented. It all depends on how Trump will view finally this idea of actually stopping provoking North Korean leaders from getting this support from the military sphere, from their military leaders, because every time there is a harsh talk from Trump or his Twitter that we will destroy North Korea and we'll push them aside, we'll show them their place. Of course, it will be shown to Kim Jong-un, and he will like, okay, so I'm the right person. You see, every time I try to start a new missile test, I'm the person who is right, because you see the approach that we have from the United States. But if Trump stops this oral approach to the problem, at least from his perspective as a president officially, maybe in the cabinet sphere he will also promote this idea, but as a president talking to the whole world, he will stop doing this. Maybe it will show North Koreans that at least from this sphere they can be sure that the United States will not move on to, well, actually using this military power that they possess in order to restrain North Koreans. And the North Koreans will lose support from the military sphere, because if they don't see this enemy trying to kill them, well, there is no need to actually promoting this idea of new tests. Why do we have tests if we will not enter the war with the United States? But this is a very difficult idea to be put in the minds of military commandment or elites in the North Korean sphere, and it's also a very difficult idea, but a simple but also difficult idea to be put in Trump's mind, to actually stop provoking from at least from this sphere. From this idea.
Yeah, it's interesting because the U.S. perception is different. It's not that Kim Jong-un is reacting to military influence, but that he's the driving decision, and whether the U.S. says nice things about him or tried to be friendly, as at times Tillerson and Obama is, or whether Trump makes the rhetorical speeches, the thinking is it doesn't have any impact. That the North Koreans say even worse things about the U.S. and are going to pursue nuclear weapons and missiles no matter what the U.S. does. So that's I think that's why that's why probably the Russian proposal is not that well known in the U.S.
Well, probably yes, but it also shows us that the influence that the military sphere has on Trump also is vital to understand, because in this sphere, when we see, and this is like the basic idea that the country that actually provokes is North Korea, and the side that actually always provoking is North Korea, then of course we have to spend more on military sphere and to make new tests around, and to work closely with South Korea and Japan regarding the military issue and the issue of containment of North Korea, because every time it's viewed from the United States side. So it's vice versa. It works vice versa, and it's all if at least on the rhetoric level on the level of communications. The two sides will stop doing these provocations orally, at least. Their official positions will change. It might lead to some reduction in number of tests. Not maybe complete stopping of tests, but at least number of tests will be reduced, because from the beginning of the Trump's administration, North Koreans, they launched as many as, like, they've never launched so many tests.
The previous year they launched more tests.
Yes, but the amount, the capacity that they showed, it shows us that it doesn't really matter. They can do it every day, but they will be not so efficient after all. But these tests, well, a couple of times the rocket flew over Japan. Of course, Japan could easily shut down this rocket, but the idea that it actually can fly so far, that's what experts didn't view a couple of years before. They understood that, well, it might happen with North Koreans, with their potential, but not in the recent future, but not in the nearest future, in like maybe 5-10 years. But it happened very fast.
I do agree with you. We underestimate. The ability of North Korea to develop an operational long-term missile.
And the same might happen with Iran. So to underestimate Iran's power to possess nuclear weapons, if this approach failed with North Korea, it can also fail with Iran. So this idea of dismissing the deal is not a good idea after all. And this is also, it's both Moscow's approach and the European approach so far. And as far as I see, most of the experts in the United States also view it as a negative perspective, from negative perspective, this idea of dismissing the deal.
Actually, since we touched upon North Korea, we have another question on the topic, which is actually two questions in one question. So the first one is it the time for United States to remove any preconditions and hold high-level direct talks and military-to-military talks with North Korea in order to prevent a miscalculation? And the second question is, are there any conditions upon which US, China and Russia would accept North Korea as a nuclear state and rely on traditional deterrence to prevent the first use? If not, what is it about North Korea that makes deterrence unlikely to succeed?
Good questions. I'm going to flip around the order a bit, because
Sure.
the thinking is that North Korea has decided it's going to become a nuclear weapon state, whether Russia, China, and the U.S. recognize it or not. I mean, they're gonna develop a nuclear arsenal for strategic defend themselves from a foreign attack, but also because they can use that as a shield to do other things. I mean, the fear is that they're going to think, well, okay, if we can now do more provocations in South Korea or someplace, and then the U.S. can't stop us because we'll threaten to strike the United States in return. So the thinking is, and President Trump tried this when he came to office. He talked about maybe going off and actually meeting with Kim Jong-un, or there was an effort in negotiations and effort to get the Chinese mediation. It was very active in the first few months, but it didn't appear to have much of an impact. At this point, I think the North Korea is pretty open that they're just going to keep on testing until they have this capacity. And then that last question comes into play. I mean, the thinking in the past was it's okay for the United States to have a mutual deterrent relationship with Soviet Union / Russia. I mean, we've had this for a long time. It's pretty stable. We understand how our forces work. It's hard to think of what would cause us to we'd fight a war over that could lead to nuclear escalation. China, the U.S. has de facto recognized this decision. It's a little different under like the Obama Nuclear Posture Review. It explicitly said we accept the mutual deterrent relationship with Russia. It didn't say that in the case of China, but in fact that is the case. But to have that with North Korea is always thought to be unacceptably risky, invitation from other countries to get these weapons. Concern that North Korea, because it's engaged in provocations at other levels, conventional, subconventional, they may do this in the nuclear field. Fear, in particular, how South Korea and Japan and Taiwan and Australia, all those countries in the past decide not to get nuclear weapons, will now decide they need them. If North Korea has a nuclear weapon, then it's kind of hard. It makes it harder to argue that Japan shouldn't, or so on, or South Korea in particular, because as you could see a symmetry between those. But in practice, if the U.S. and Russia and China and others are unable to prevent North Korea from continuing to develop its nuclear arsenal and missile tests, we could de facto end up with this kind of construct. It's a question of whether the U.S. and it does would intervene militarily to prevent this. And so far that appears, it's certainly not anything anyone wants, and it appears that will not be the case. So we could de facto, I mean, the solution to the Korea problem is clear, which is you have a change in regime in the north, you have reunification with South Korea, and so you get a unified Korea. It looks like South Korea now. There are no nuclear weapons there. There's some kind of limits and any troops, U.S. troops there, to make sure that Russia and China are not disturbed, their security isn't threatened. That's the solution, right? But how you get there from here is just very, very unclear.
And not like only how you get there, but what you will have after it, after you have the united Korea. How can you integrate the people that were grown up in this North Korean regime into the South Korean world that they're not used to? And how can you persuade the elites in North Korea that they will not be persecuted after the collapse of the regime, or will not be put into jails or else? It's a level of persuasion and of a level of trust. If there is no trust between the countries and the elites or on other levels, then there can be no talks. And after all, there is no such a level of trust now, unfortunately. We come to a zero trust.
Dr. Krashenko, what do you think? Is there any perspective that Russia will recognize the nuclear status of North Korea?
Well, I don't think Russia is eager to recognize the state of North Korea as a nuclear power. Because it might lead to the extension of it, to the domino effect that our countries always feared, but unfortunately couldn't prevent it from happening. And now India and Pakistan and also Israel have these weapons, and Presumably, yes, presumably. And the same with North Korea. Regarding the nuclear tests, we have some data regarding this fear, but not exact data. Nobody has the exact data of how many nuclear weapons are in North Korea and how many nuclear weapons are in Israel. From Israel's side, there is some data, but it's from Israel's side. Does it really wants to exaggerate things or not? But we know for sure that Israel will not use these nuclear weapons because it will destroy Israel as well. So it's not in the interest of Israel, but it will use it as a big stick to show like, do not attack Israel anymore because you will be destroyed eventually. So, and it works so far because from the terrorist group, yes, they attack Israel, but there is no big war in Israel between Israel and other countries. Well, Lebanon tried, but eventually it failed. So, presumably, nobody will want to recognize North Korea as a nuclear power. It will be like maybe viewed as a power that somehow contain these weapons, but would not recognize it in our club.
Yeah, I think their vision is doing what India and Pakistan have done. Build up nuclear forces and de facto be recognized, even if not de jure. I mean, because already now India and Pakistan are talking about getting them into the nuclear suppliers group, and so you're sort of, even though those arsenals are illegal according to the non-proliferation treaty, you're sort of taking them for granted in how you deal with those countries.
Yes, outside of the club, but still somehow getting close to it.
Okay, so then the next question we have is also, it's 3 questions in 1 question. So the first one is about general, like nuclear deterrence and arms control. It's to what extent are the states' nuclear relations depend on wider foreign policy concerns, and to what extent are they constitutive of them? For example, does Washington sanctions towards Moscow reduce the prospects of nuclear arms control between 2 countries, or would a new nuclear deal offer a means to improve their relations? And the second question is not related to it, so I guess it's better to do step by step.
The first question is really interesting. In the past, that was seen as, the nuclear arms control bore the brunt of the relationship. So you would often assess the Soviet-U.S. relationship by the disarmament talks. A lot of tension was focused on the START and then the New START process. And then at the end of the Cold War, it widened considerably. We had a more diverse relationship. But as we're going back towards a narrower, and the ties, the other possible ties, the economic ties, the things are shrinking, then the nuclear arms control question looms larger as a measure of the success. That's the interesting contrast with the relationship the U.S. has with China, because it's a much more richer relationship, such economic ties, academic ties, other ties. The fact there is no nuclear arms control doesn't seem to, bother people more with the economic ties and so on. I had hoped that the Russia-U.S. relationship would move in that direction. We have a more robust, but I mean, we don't need to go into the Kotovinovac question, but it is enough to say that we have not reached that. And so this nuclear question, the question of arms control, is going to be more focused. And a related interesting question we need to consider is, let's just say INF falls apart, we don't renew New START. So the U.S.-Russia relationship looks like the U.S.-China relationship, no arms control. What does that mean? It's probably not as bad as it would have been during the Cold War, because there are other means of deterrence as well that make it more difficult to contemplate a war, because we don't quite know how cyber and other things will come into play. But it does not assist the improvement in the overall relationship, even if it doesn't drive it.
Yes, it's like many parallel things going on. So there's nuclear arms control and arms control, sanctions, political sphere, economic, cultural sphere, they're all going in parallel ways. And if we stop or start talking about one sphere doesn't mean that it will somehow coexist in a good way with another one. They'll just go parallel ways, separate ways.
Compartmentalize.
Yeah, so in this case, I don't think that it will somehow really help our relations or really influence from a negative perspective our relations in the nearest future. It all depends on the ways the leadership in the country tries to view it from the point that it's in the interest of leadership to talk about the improvement in this sphere, because now for now, both in the United States so far and in Russia, the electorate is not so eager to support the idea of a nuclear-free world, because it will lead eventually to the idea that, what we've talked about before, that if there are no nuclear weapons, that there might be a new war, a new global war, because there's no shield of protection from these countries to actually fight with each other.
If you ask the U.S. electorate, they probably would say, "Yeah, I'm in favor of getting rid of nuclear weapons," but it's not an important issue for most people. People vote on healthcare, on the economy,
reform,
views of
immigration,
personality. So the nuclear issue is not it's more at the elite level where this comes into play.
Because it takes too much money to spend on this nuclear sphere, on this nuclear shield. Because so far Trump also insisted on getting some extra money in this sphere, as far as I've heard. So it means that this budget idea of always getting more and more money to this nuclear shield will lead eventually to the idea that it will never disappear, because all this money will go, and all these people who are protecting this nuclear materials, they will go. They will be just dismissed, not working, and so what we'll do with this? So it's one good idea will follow up to the idea that what to do with it afterwards. It's like with North Korea, if we unite the Koreas, what we'll do with it afterwards? So can we make the Koreans happy after all?
It's a big question.
Yeah.
So, and from the same reader, he also asked about the New START agreement. So, what is the likelihood that it will be prolonged beyond the 2021 or extended to the third-party countries? So maybe we'll start with you. So,
well, from Russian perspective, we promote the idea that it should be prolonged, but we will look closely on the United States part, and especially on Trump's idea of getting to the next election, 2020. Will he be eager to participate? For now, he is eager to participate, but maybe his support among the voters will be much lower than it is now, and there will be no point of him actually participating in the next elections. So it will lead to the idea that there might come another leader, another administration with another ideas through this to support this prolongation of the START treaty, or the next year when there will be midterm elections, and maybe it will change the political sphere a little bit, or maybe shake it up a little bit, so that some fresh ideas will come to the minds of congressmen, and after all comes to the minds of Trump administration, that there is at least a necessity to prolong this START treaty, and then we will show, like it was with Obama administration, it led to the negative point of our relationship after all, that but it coexists with the idea of reducing nuclear weapons. So maybe this will be a good sign of also somehow restarting relations after all. So, but it all depends from Russian perspective. It depends on the American side, on the politicals, because it tends to be viewed here as Trump doesn't get too much support among the political establishment and cannot do much with it. So, if he has some leverage and he has some tools that he can operate, maybe it will lead to some improvement in this sphere. But for now, it's viewed only as a good proposal. But proposal also needs to meet the basic needs of a second person or second part in this sphere. So we'll have to wait for at least for next year to come, and maybe it will be viewed in a good way after all.
Okay, and
Yeah, as far as according to media reports, in I think it was the first or second of the conversations that President Putin and President Trump had, President Putin suggested extending New START, and President Trump's initial reaction was, no, it's not a good deal. But since then we haven't heard anything, and we'll probably know from what comes out of the nuclear posture review. Russia and the U.S. appear to be in compliance with the treaty and so on, so it wouldn't be difficult to extend it. You don't need congressional approval. We don't need Duma approval. So it can be easily done if the administration in the U.S. decides it wants to do that, but we still don't know what their views are. In terms of getting new countries, though, to sign on, that's harder. We saw that with the INF treaty, that, countries were saying it's great that Russia and the U.S. are signing this treaty, but nobody else wanted to join it. And so START, even less so. The Chinese position, as we already mentioned, is that once Russia and China and the U.S. get rid of their net weapons, we'll consider getting rid of ours. And then the British and the French don't want their nuclear deterrence to be considered as part. They say they need these for national defense. They don't really come into the equation because Russia and the U.S. have so many more than we do. Whereas the Russian general, the U.S. side, it's Russia versus U.S. calculation, but the Russian generals, when they talk about Russia having to defend itself against France, Britain, U.S. and other countries like China,
part of NATO, so it's always
So what they consider to be equal is different from what the U.S. side is being equal. But as you mentioned earlier, the money factor may come into play. It sounds, even if the administration wants to put a lot of money in building more nuclear forces, there is opposition among even its base about anything, wants to cut government spending and so on, to spending money on a weapon we will probably never use, hopefully. And so, I think I also just think that there's not a lot of enthusiasm for increasing the U.S. nuclear arsenal. There's support for keeping it functional and viable and modernizing some of the systems, but not for increasing the numbers or.
Well, it doesn't really mean to increase, but to modernize, to make it a weapon that can be easily overcome the Russian capacity to fire them. So
the Russia is, of course, modernizing its arsenal, which is rational from a Russian point of view, insofar as they think the worry about U.S. missile defenses. The easiest way to get rid of that worry is to strengthen their offensive forces because they can overcome them.
So it's never stopping race in this case.
But it is constrained though. Because I don't think the Russian government is not eager to spend a lot of money on these either. They have other priorities.
Because it's too much money spending on this. But we've seen Trump administration decreasing the number that it's eager to spend on the diplomacy, as far as we've seen USA reductions, and so perhaps if it follow up this idea, we can find out that Trump is eager to spend money on modernizing the nuclear materials. In favor of this, he will reduce in other spheres, like making it to be more balanced budget. So we reduce here, but we add here. So it's simple logic of a businessman. So
though Congress and others normally resist radical changes in that distribution. So,
but military budget, we've seen it got too much support after all.
Okay, so the same person also asked about the third parties.
Very interested person would say.
Yes, he's interested in quite a few things. So, when the final question from him is, what is the role of third-party non-nuclear states in brokering nuclear disarmament? I'm thinking especially
Third-party non-nuclear states.
yes, in brokering nuclear disarmament.
Well, yeah, like the nuclear abolition treaty, the nuclear convention. What do they call it? It's a chemical weapons nuclear weapons convention, nuclear weapons treaty. The one the UN.
Nobel Prize.
Yes. And he also mentions the Vatican and and the Middle Powers Initiative.
Remember what Stalin said about the Pope? How many divisions does he have?
Yes.
So the lobby on principle would like a nuclear-free world. The problem has always been, how do you get there, and how do you ensure nobody cheats? Because there's always incentive to hang on to a couple, just because if you could have them and nobody else does, it really puts you in a great position. And Russia, and we have actually seen Russia, China, and U.S. cooperation in the nuclear sphere. It was cooperation against this treaty, is what it was. So all those governments came out, the existing nuclear weapon states, and said, okay, nuclear free world's fine, but this is the wrong way to go about it. You can't just pass a treaty and without verification say, okay, you can get rid of all of them. You need to do what we've been doing so far, which is have step-by-step progression. These are such dangerous weapons that you need to be very comprehensive and prudent about how you get rid of them. And so it might have made sense to have a nuclear weapons convention before anybody had them, but now since there are, you just have to back off. And so this treaty has been adopted but it's not had much impact so far. It may over time. I don't know much about this field, but people in social thinking think about that over time the norms of non-nuclear world will be strengthened by this, and it may at some point have a logic in future generations. It clearly influence Obama's thinking. It may influence future leaders, but for now, the role of third parties in overall nuclear disarmament is small, but I imagine they could be very important in particular cases. So, for example, on Iran's thinking about whether to get a nuclear weapon, or Turkey's thinking about getting a nuclear weapon, or South Korea, Japan, others, anyone that you could get a nuclear weapon but hasn't so far, I imagine that the thinking and statement of other countries will have an impact. Secretary Tillerson at the UN mentioned, for example, what happened with Kazakhstan, right? The Kazakhs gave up the nuclear weapons they inherited from the Soviet Union and played a leading role in supporting international test ban and nuclear disarmament. And it gains them some diplomatic influence. It certainly has not hurt the country doing that. And so that's a good example to follow. We wish North Korea would be like Kazakhstan. I imagine the Iranian thinking on this is going to be influenced by what they hear from neighbors, and Turkey, of course, it goes back and it's in a very precarious situation with all its potential partners, and so I imagine insofar as Europeans and Arab states are telling Turkey not to go get a nuclear weapon, that's having some impact. I guess in Latin America probably had a benign effect. I think there was a good example that once some countries started stopping their nuclear programs, others followed, and now there's a general consensus in South America not to pursue nuclear capabilities, and so that's good. But so it has good regional influence, and it could be more important in the future. But for now, it's not affecting the Russia, U.S., China discourse on disarmament.
South Africa maybe as well can be added to the list.
Well, probably yes.
It gave up the nuclear weapons.
It reminds me a bit of UN Security Council, this whole sphere of veto, and adding more countries to this list of countries that possesses the right to veto. All these 5 countries don't really want the new ones to enter. So it's the same with the nuclear disarmament. So the proliferation. Nobody wants countries, the newcomers, to have this weapons, and those who already possess it don't really want to get rid of it totally. But those who do not have them also, well, some of them want weapons or don't want other ones to have the weapons. So it's the same with the veto right. So those who do not have the veto right always are talking about, like in India or in Germany, like we have to have this veto right because we will use it because the world is not as it was during the Cold War, and it's blah blah blah. So it's always these ideas and these talks that go on and so on. But it doesn't really go anywhere far enough to influence this sphere of adding new countries to the United States Security Council, United Nations Security Council veto.
Yeah. So far, we've been very fortunate in the nuclear non-proliferation realm because, 30 years ago we thought, and this is like a 60, 70-year-old technology, so many countries could get nuclear weapons, but so far it's just been the existing nuclear weapon states, Pakistan, India, Israel or not, who knows? I certainly don't have any. And
maybe it's a bluff,
right? And then North Korea, and Iran is potential, but so far the Iranians have said, and there's no evidence now that they're currently seeking a nuclear weapon, and they said they wouldn't. But it's not. The countries I mentioned, it's all very hypothetical. There's no active movement in any of these countries to get a nuclear weapon. Mm-hmm. There's nobody else in the pipeline. So the thinking is, if we can just hold the fire break with Iran and North Korea, that will cap it. There's no evident country out there that would need a nuclear weapon. But if we fail and Iran, North Korea get a nuclear weapon, then who knows? We worry about the negative dynamics regionally, in particular.
Maybe we can see the cooperation between this non-nuclear club countries, who like it happened with South Africa when it developed its nuclear program. It's cooperated a lot with. If I'm correct, with Pakistan and presumably with Israel. So and actually in the end it could build a nuclear weapon. So if we fail with Iran and North Korea, do you see it as possible that we'll see the chain of these countries cooperating with each other?
I don't think it's very much of a possibility, because actually getting a nuclear weapon is a very expensive tool, and it's very expensive idea that will follow up for many years to get it. And the countries that were close enough to get it were they really close enough to get it? From their perspective, from their talks, they were close. I am almost there, but who knows for sure that you are almost there? I mean, that you're getting these weapons, like you've mentioned, Israel or North Korea. We know that they presumably have, but what amount of nuclear weapons they have? So the same with these countries, they may be talking, some of the leaders, because this trend to promote populism nowadays, it's a very negative trend. It may follow up with some countries, especially the third world countries, saying like and promoting this idea, new strategy, like we have to get these nuclear weapons, or we have to unite to get a nuclear one missile for like for our countries, for like 5 countries or 7 countries, because this one missile will help us to defend from Western countries or from giant terrorism threat or something like that. But it's just hypothetical, and I don't really see it as a possibility to come.
Okay, so we have a final question from our reader. It's a rather long one, but I will take the liberty to shorten it a bit. So it's, basically, the reader asks us to imagine that global zero is accessible, and if it is accessible, which mechanism would you, specific verifiable mechanism would you recommend to ensure the nuclear weapons will be fully abolished? And do you see any merit of abolishing nuclear weapons if a more lethal weapon will appear by that time in the future.
Okay, this is a closing question. I want to then thank you for participating, and thank you for posting it.
Thank you.
Thank you for participating. And then also the MacArthur Foundation has been supporting my research in this domain, Russia, China, and the U.S. And there I would actually think that some of their other work. So I've not looked at this issue too much about what if you abolish nuclear weapons, how do you what the mechanism of verification should be, and what other potential threats are there. But they've been supporting a lot of thinking on this, and the worry has always been that even if you eliminate the weapons, there's still the knowledge out there, and how do you control the knowledge? In terms of a more destructive technology, I'm not sure. Maybe that would be a bioweapon that can wipe out the human race, and it's less easy to stop and less visible. But I have to suggest that we look at the work that some of my colleagues and some of the other people funded by the MacArthur Foundation are working on. As well as probably some of the we mentioned the UN. They have some disarmament organizations that have been publishing on this, but I'm not sure precisely what the criteria would be. But again, I imagine if we're going to get to a nuclear-free world, and if we're going to keep it that way, then Russia, China, and U.S. will play a pivotal role in this domain.
Well, as we've talked about this throughout our presentation and our talks regarding the sphere of ground zero, as we put it this way, I don't really see it as a possibility of a world without nuclear weapons, even if it's a noble idea, Nobel Prize winning idea that is it's a good idea, but it's a very utopic idea. It's like the end of history idea that we've had for many years now, but there is no ending of history so far. The only type of a good idea that exists, and it is a good sign that some ideas can be promoted and can be end up with a good view, is like this idea of that Western democracies do not fight with each other, and so maybe if this idea really works so far, maybe this idea of a world without, not like completely without nuclear weapons, but with a very high reduction number in nuclear weapons, maybe it will lead to a better world so far, and the money that is spent on this nuclear weapons can be directed, and this flowing of money will be more used in the sphere of promoting social life and connections and the economic ties, especially in the countries of the third world, and the migration issues that follow up this issue of poor life and the conditions where people live in. Maybe all this money will be going in that direction. It's also a utopic idea, but still some ideas that were considered to be utopia follow up to be living up ideas that are actually surviving and going up to something really good. So maybe this idea that somehow is viewed today as a very utopic idea in the nearest future, not in the nearest future, I guess, but in like 10 or 20 years will lead up to something new. But then some spicy things we can add up here. So you mentioned biological weapons. If we only talk about this idea of nuclear weapons that can destroy humanity, there are also very many types of weapons that are also prohibited, like the chemical weapons, but are still used, and other like methods and tools of war that are prohibited by the international law, but are still used even in minor conflicts in our time. So is it so effective to say that we can somehow get rid of all the weapons, especially nuclear weapons? I don't think so, but still it's a good idea, and the good ideas should be promoted anyway.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ilya Kravchenko and Richard Weiss. I think it was a very interesting discussion. And if anyone wants to continue it, you can do it in the comment section, or write us your piece of opinion, like op-eds or something like that. That
Yeah, you have a very
will also be
active
very
website.
welcome.
Yeah.
Yes. We'll very much welcome that. So thank you very much again for your time, and stay tuned with our future webinars.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.